Jesus is King. Welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, Rebuilding Christendom, Restoring Catholic Culture and Tradition. I'm Timothy Flanders, Editor-in-Chief of OnePeterFive. I'm joined today by an esteemed guest, Father Gerald Murray. Father Murray, how are you doing? It's an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Timothy. Great to be with you and your viewers.
Yes, if you don't know Father Murray, he's a priest of the Archdiocese of New York. He's a pastor of the Church of the Holy Family in Manhattan. He is a canon lawyer, a guest commentator on religious news on EWTN, Fox News, and other media outlets. He was ordained in 1984. He has served parishes in the Bronx and Manhattan. He was also a chaplain for 11 years with the U.S. Navy, Naval Reserve. And he's also studied canon law at the Pontifical Gregorian University from 93 to 97. And he got his doctorate at 98. He's also a regular columnist at thecatholicthing.org and at humanlifereview.com. So we're talking about his new book with Diane Montagna. It's a book-length interview, and it's called Calming the Storm, Navigating the Crises Facing the Catholic Church and Society. So you can pre-order that book below. Follow the link. You can have access to the ebook now, and then the print copy will be available early April. So, Father Murray, can you start with the image that you picked for the title of this book, which you go back to throughout the book, is the calming of the storm? Why is this image so important? Why was it important for the message you want to bring in this book?
Well, the image, of course, is from the scriptural account of our Lord's falling asleep in the boat as they were crossing the Sea of Galilee, and then the storm came up, and then the Lord was awoken by the apostles, and then he rebuked them, calmed the storm. That was picked as the motif by my co-author, Diane Montagna, who is a Vatican journalist. She is well known for her writing. And in addition, she did an interview book with Bishop Athanasius Schneider of Kazakhstan. And that book was sort of the inspiration for this one. Interview books, going back to the Ratzinger Report, are a good way to communicate with the faithful and anyone who's interested. In fact, Cardinal Sarras, he's done 3 interview books with Nicolas Diat, a French journalist. They've had great impact. So Scott Hahn actually proposed to Diane and myself that we would do an interview book. And we both agreed, and that's how it came about. Now, Diane figured out that she wanted to make the book topical in the way that my commentary on EWTN, on Raymond Arroyo's program, The World Over, is usually about topics of the day, but we wanted to do it from a theological perspective. So we wanted to look at how is the life of the church to be interpreted according to how the Lord guided the boat, the ship that he was in with the apostles when they were in the midst of a storm, which is very much what the church is in right now. So that's I guess the goal is to say what we're going through now is not completely unexpected, and the solution is at hand.
Yes, it does a fantastic job of that. Your book is endorsed by Bishop Schneider, also Cardinals Sarah, Muller, and Burke. And yeah, you mentioned those other great interview books. One of the things I liked about it is that it did provide a background for your own faith, going back to your family. That one of the big themes of the book is family. Can you tell us about how you grew up? What was the impact of your parents? Because you grew up during some storms as well. And what was the impact of your parents in your life growing up?
Well, it was a very positive and good impact. I was born in 1959, so the Vatican Council was just about to start. And I guess you can say I've grown up in this post-Vatican II church, but my parents gave me a solid grounding that the church didn't start, in 1965 when the council ended. They were well-educated Catholics. My dad was a product of Jesuit education, high school, college, and law school. My mom went to the Convent of the Sacred Heart, Religious of the Sacred Heart, for high school and college, and then she went to Fordham Law. So my parents are both lawyers. They met in law school, and they were always devout practicing Catholics, intellectually curious readers. My dad put me on to G.K. Chesterton when I was in high school. I also remember the first time I saw him reading a book called Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Newman. And I was curious. I had begun studying Latin in high school. I said, "Oh, that's interesting, a Latin title to an English language book." And then, of course, I took a great interest in Cardinal Newman after that. So yeah, my dad was a real reader. My mom too, but Dad, to a greater extent, kind of pushed books onto me to read. And no, I remember back even in my seventh and eighth grade, my dad was a reader of The Wanderer. So we had articles about things going on in the church, and I didn't quite understand everything then, but I got some idea that there were some problems. And then that developed as I got through high school and college.
Wonderful. So, could you you mentioned Chesterton and Newman? What other books had a big impact on you growing up that helped you keep your faith into the 70s and your ordination?
Well, I say my worldview was formed by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for one. The Gulag Archipelago was a book I remember reading and being very moved by. I read a number of books about communist persecution of the church. So that was, my dad was a National Review Catholic, so we were very much anti-communist, defending the church and then defending those who were persecuted. When I got to college, I started reading Hilaire Belloc, then started, dipping into more of Newman, trying to understand the fathers of the church. And I'm a history major in college, so I did read a lot of history, and we focused mainly on medieval and Renaissance history in the program that I was able to put together. One of the things about college is they don't train you. You have to train yourself to pick the courses. And so we had some wonderful history teachers. So by studying the history of the church through, the grand days of the Middle Ages to then the difficulties of the Counter-Reformation and then to the spread of the faith through the missionary activity, I got a better view and understanding of divine providence in history.
Excellent. Divine providence history. Well, speaking of the history, so you turned 10 years old in 1969, and then you're growing up further in the 1970s. I want to get your comment on the Second Vatican Council. You say on page 84, you say, quote, "The Second Vatican Council was an attempt to incorporate the idea of finding a new way to exist in the post-war world, but it largely failed on this score because it wasn't done in a vacuum." And then you mentioned communism and socialism. So could you elaborate on why you see the Second Vatican Council as sort of a historical failure? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I would say it's a failure in terms of its projected outcome, that it had the idea that if we engaged in a positive dialogue with the forces, intellectual and political forces of the post-war European world, that we would make Christianity even more attractive to people. And that notion I tie into kind of the new hope provided by the United Nations after the Second World War. I mean, the horrors of Nazi Germany, the Imperial Japan, and then the post-war unfortunate rise of Russian communism, an even greater evil force in the world. The hope was that the UN would bring nations together, we'd avoid war, but that, of course, didn't really come about. And the dialogue with the world became more or less a listening session for the church and then trying to imitate what the world did. And I think what the basic problem that the post-Vatican II church experienced was they had expectations that didn't match realities, that the idea that we could change a few things and safeguard the heritage of faith and the life of piety. Well, once you started changing things, people said, well, why did I do all those things in the past? Were they really worth it? So Fish on Friday went, but with it went the whole idea of public penance. And, it used to be you had to fast from midnight in order to receive communion. And then Pope Pius XII made it 3 hours. Well, now we're down to 1 hour. So casualness became sort of the default position. And I think part of that is the idea, well, if we want to appeal to people, we have to make it easy for them. And it's just really not a good idea because by its nature, Catholicism makes demands, but those demands are in line with the deepest desires of human nature.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I found fascinating was that you were at the same parish as the von Hildebrands in New York. So 1966 on, what was the liturgy like that you remember there at that parish in the 60s and 70s?
Yes, well, I was an altar boy. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I finished second grade in Brooklyn. And then my parents moved to Westchester County, just north of the Bronx, to New Rochelle, New York. And in my parish were Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand, and then also Madeline and Lyman Stebbins. And they had founded Catholics United for the Faith, which was an important apostolate in the late 70s, 80s, and afterwards. The parish we had a wonderful pastor who had been a seminary professor for many years, Monsignor Moriarty, and the Mass was said with reverence. But I do remember learning the prayers at the foot of the altar in English. So when I first became an altar boy in third grade, I had to memorize those. The Mass was said facing the people, but it was an experience that I found to be reverential and not too casual. We did, on the other hand, have a folk mass that was offered in the gymnasium. In those days, they had what they call overflow masses. So the 11 o'clock was the most popular time. So, it was 11 or 11:30, and then in the gym, you had a mass that started 10 minutes later for all those who couldn't fit in the church. We don't have that problem so often these days. But that was a folk mass, and I have to say, I never really found that too enticing. It just didn't have the same spirit as the high mass in those days. They had 3 professional singers who came in and sang polyphony and Gregorian type music. So that was beautiful. So as a kid, I did have a good impression of the sacrality of the Mass, that it wasn't a casual experience.
So did your parish maintain a certain amount of this reverence even through changes in the Mass? Was that pretty much maintained, or was there a big upheaval when people were trying to impose more irreverent changes?
Yeah, reverence was not a big problem at my parish. The priests were dedicated and serious. So that was, it was other places where you would find strange things. I remember as a kid being taken to a Mass by my parents where they basically used French bread in a basket for Holy Communion. And when it came time for communion, we didn't go up. The basket was passed to us. And I looked at my mom and said, "What is this?" And she said, "Just take it, the body of Christ." That kind of thing was an exception. That was not a good experience. So things of that sort were around, but I was not, thank God I was not exposed to a lot of it.
Yeah, thank God you had this formation as a young child through this time. You had great parents. You had sounds like one of the best liturgies around that you could really find at the time. Now, something that's really interesting to me is that your book deals a lot with marriage. And when we talk about marriage and sexual morality, a lot of focus is on sins against nature, the new transgenderism and things. But something that you bring out early on is you start off in the tribunal, and you notice something with the way that annulments are being done. And I find this very interesting because that's a much more widespread issue. Can you speak to the way annulments were done? I think this was in 1970s or 80s when you first started being employed. Tell us about annulments then and now.
Yes, well, I studied canon law in Rome. I was ordained in 1984, and then in 1993, Cardinal O'Connor sent me to Rome to study canon law. So I was a priest already 9 years, and I did 4 years, obtained a doctorate. And when I came back, I was assigned to the marriage tribunal, the Archdiocesan Tribunal. But the ideas of the judicial vicar were that basically anybody who applied for an annulment and cooperated with the process would be given an annulment, or a declaration of nullity, more properly called. So I got there and I said, well, how many cases did you judge last year? And it was somewhere in the realm of maybe 800 cases. This was back in 1998. And I said, well, how many of those cases were found, that the plea for nullity was not granted? And he said, well, maybe 2 or 3. So it was evident to me they were not following the Roman jurisprudence, which I had studied when I was in Rome, how to approach marriage under the, you make a petition and you say this marriage was invalid because of lack of psychological maturity. And so it's basically an assertion that you weren't really up to getting married because you really didn't understand based on your psychological preparation or state of being at the time. And this was very much contested by rodal judges. So the ROTA is the Court of Appeals for American or all marriage tribunals throughout the world. If cases get appealed, in other words, an annulment's granted, and then the defendant, so to speak, says, no, I think this was a valid marriage, I appeal my case to Rome. Not in many cases end up there, but the ones that did from America, I found, a great majority of those were the validity of the marriage was upheld because they didn't accept this very easy jurisprudence saying that, if the marriage didn't work out, well, that's an automatic sign that there was a psychological impediment to getting married. So needless to say, the judicial vicar wasn't happy when I told him I didn't agree with him, and I was soon out of the tribunal. Then I went back to parish work, which was a real joy and pleasure. It's much more rewarding, although tribunal work is necessary and good and rewarding, but if it's done properly. Things have gotten better because Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II and Benedict, over time, were saying we have to get away from this easy approach to annulments. So more cases are being turned down. Another reality, though, is there are less practicing Catholics out there who worry about getting married a second time in the church if they get divorced. So the volume of cases has gone way down in the New York Tribunal. And, that's a whole nother story about the lack of practice of the faith, which is this next generation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And we'll get into Amoris Laetitia in a minute. What you have in here is that 90%, this is page 55, 90% of the appealed decisions that got from American tribunals to the Roman Rota, 90% of those were overturning the American decisions.
Yeah, I studied a period, maybe 2 years worth of opinions, because what happens is the Roman court, everything is done in Latin. And at the end of a judicial year, they will publish what they call the sentences. These are the written decisions. And they don't publish all of them, but they publish a selection. And then the American cases, you would look for them because you know where the defendant was that identified. They wouldn't give the name of the parties, but they would give the place where it was from. Yes, and I found 90% were overturning because there are theories about human agency or human action, the ability to bind yourself by your words so that you can create a new state of life, so to speak, that when you enter into marriage, you know what you're doing and you actually do it. So there are those who contest that and say, no, people really aren't capable of doing that unless they're, certified as the most psychologically balanced person in the world. Well, that's not how God created humanity, and how, knowing the effects of original sin, the Lord said, what God has joined, man must not divide. So if the Lord says that, that means we're capable of that permanency in marriage, even if it's difficult.
Yeah, you say on page 55, the church's understanding of human nature is that God created us such that the average ordinary person can make a binding commitment of himself or herself in marriage. So how do you prepare couples for marriage to make sure that they truly understand this, they can contract a valid marriage, and that marriage can be fruitful, not just with children, but spiritually and emotionally?
Sure. Well, the presumption, there's the thing called the natural right to marriage. So when you come in the door, you don't have to convince me that you're supposed to get married and are able to. The presumption is you are. But we have to understand, since marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church, and your intention has to be married permanently, with this one person until death do you part. So we want people to understand what their commitment they're making, because it is a free choice. You have a right to marry, but then you also have a right to pick the one you want to marry. And then the person you pick may not agree with you. So you have to then get a mutual agreement on that. So I focus on trying to understand the ends and purpose of marriage. They have to be open to life. It's a permanent bond. It has to be exclusive. You can't intend to be adulterous and, as part of your marriage lifestyle, things of this sort. And, basically understand that people, even with their imperfect psychological profile, because none of us is untouched by, both physical or psychological wounds in life, nonetheless, we are capable of doing something that God intends, which is the man and woman come together to propagate the species and express in love mutual support for one another.
Absolutely. Now, the arguments that began to proliferate, this is starting with Cardinal Casper in the 1990s, the arguments began to be made that people are not catechized, or they just don't understand marriage, or all these different things. The people are just weak. They can't really endure with their marriage. So they got divorced and they got remarried. And now we just need to be merciful to these people. In all fairness, is there anything to be said for that? If people are not catechized, is there anything to be said for that reality from that argument?
Well, you have to have a minimal understanding or a base minimum of knowledge of what you're doing. So you have to understand that marriage is about the procreation and education of children in a permanent bond, which is exclusive. So in other words, you have to intend that you're going to be married to this person for the rest of your life, and you're open to receiving children, which means you are willing to have marital relations. In other words, you know what marriage is about. Marriage is, it falls under the species or the category of a friendship, but it's a friendship that's unlike any other, because it's a friendship in which you give to each other the right and expectation of sexual relations in view of bringing new life into the world. So, that's the way God made us. And it's not, you don't have to have a theology degree or even a profound understanding of the theology of the human body or of marriage in order to enter into it. What happens is, in modern society, we live among a group of Christians who don't accept that, which is most of the Protestant world. And then you have the vast world of people who have no idea of Christianity. And I think most people, when they get married, do intend to be with the person for the rest of their life, they're not so committed to that they won't say, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll find some other person. So there's lots of confusion out there. And then that divorce type mentality enters into Catholic minds. So it's the more annulments, the more people kind of have that in the back of their mind. I can get out of this if it doesn't work. But then again, does that mean it compromises your will because you're really not intending to be married for life? Those kind of things have to be explored. So it's part of the general decline that the understanding of marriage is less, but you don't need to profound understanding to be able to say, I want to marry, because otherwise illiterate people could never validly marry. And the vast majority of people in the history of the world are illiterate. The Casper position is basically looking for justification to allow divorce in the church.
Yeah. So do you talk a lot about Amoris Laetitia. You state that Amoris Laetitia cannot be reconciled with prior teaching. So can you break down what is Amoris Laetitia saying? Why can that not be reconciled?
Yes, well, we're talking about the famous footnote in the Amoris Laetitia, in which it says that the help of the sacraments can be given to some couples who are in invalid second marriages. And what this means is you have a Catholic who is married in a valid marriage and then leaves that marriage and then begins cohabiting or living together with another person, but they wish to continue to receive Holy Communion. And the church has always taught this is not possible because the first marriage has its own existence. The first marriage is presumed to be valid unless proven otherwise. If you think the marriage was invalid, you petition the tribunal to hear your case, and they'll evaluate the evidence. But, in church law and in sacramental understanding, if you say your vows before a priest and know and intend what you're doing, then you're married. So to have sexual relation with anybody else, whether it be on a temporary, occasional, or permanent basis, that doesn't cause your first marriage to go away. You're still married. So it's adulterous relations. So the church says people living in an adulterous union are objectively contradicting Christ's teaching. And therefore, it is scandalous to allow them to receive the sacraments. And likewise, the presumption is people who commit a grave sin are probably subjectively guilty of that sin because they know the church says don't do that, because Christ said don't do that. So to claim that, well, my conscience allows me because I don't consider adultery to be a mortal sin, well, you have to sort that out with God. God's message is the opposite. But the church, in the meantime, isn't going to confirm you and say, well, I guess you're right, you can figure it out, so we're not going to be restricting your reception of communion. So I think the Pope made a mistake in this. This was the very point that the four dubia cardinals approached the Pope with, to say, Holy Father, we do not see how you can reconcile giving Holy Communion to some people in adulterous unions with the traditional teaching of the Church, which had been repeated multiple times, and recently by both Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. It was in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, still is. So, but Pope Francis has a different view on that. And that's where I say, Pope Francis, with all due respect, I do not see how you can reconcile this with church teaching. And sad to say, Holy Father, your refusal to answer the dubia did not provide any further light. In fact, it confirmed me that this is a problem. And that's what I state in the book. And I hope and pray that the next Pope is going to withdraw this, because it's leading to confusion and leading people to objectively doing something they're not supposed to do. People committing adultery on a regular basis should not be receiving communion.
So what would you say to the defenders of Pope Francis? Now, I think in particular the respected theologian, Dr. Robert Festigi, and he points out that Francis, in his 2020 book, Let Us Dream, page 88, says, quote, there was no need to change church law, only how it was applied, end quote. And Festigi comments that Pope Francis explicitly states that Amoris Laetitia introduces no change in church law or doctrine. This is a sufficient response to the dubia. So this is Dr. Festigi. How do you respond to that, stating that, well, Pope Francis has said it is reconcilable?
Well, I respect Dr. Festigi, but I disagree with him. It's not compatible. To state that it is doesn't make it so. It's quite clearly taught by Pope John Paul II and Benedict that people are in an objective state of sin regarding adulterous or irregular unions, as they're euphemistically called, that they are not qualified to receive Holy Communion unless they're living as brother and sister for the sake of any children they may have had. They maintain their union, but they do not engage in adulterous relations, and they don't give scandal to the community. The Pope has defended this teaching. He's praised the bishops' conferences that went along with him, yet he's ignored the dubia. If just as a matter of debate, irregardless of who's involved, if you state a position that is widely seen to be a departure from the previous teaching, and then you refuse to defend it, it's not sufficient to simply say, well, what looks like a change really isn't, but on the other hand, people can now do things that my predecessor didn't let them do. This doesn't make logical sense.
Yes, and this goes into another thing that you talk a lot about, which is the breakdown of law and order, canonical law and civil law. And I want to get into that in a minute, but first, I want to ask about correcting the Pope, because you maintain the two sort of aspects of this. One, you say on page 66, quote, if the Pope has made a mistake in his interpretation, it's necessary to tell him that, end quote. But then you also say at page 99 that there is division in the church because people are arrogating to themselves an authority they don't have. You say the Pope has authority over me, I have no authority over him. How do we keep that balance between respecting the authority of the Pope and yet correcting him?
Well, correcting the Pope in this sense is advising him that he's made a mistake. So I have no authority to command him to withdraw and retract his mistake, but I do have, the duty as a Christian brother in the church. This is a form of fraternal correction. And it is not impertinent or disloyal to tell someone that we think they've done something wrong and mistaken, and then offer the reasons for that. So that's what I've tried to do in this question. It also applies. The Pope endorsed homosexual civil unions as a way of approaching people two homosexuals living together in a sexual relationship. He said that the state should grant them some form of union. He said not a marriage, but some form of union. This directly contradicts what John Paul II had taught during his pontificate, that the church should never endorse any form of state sanction of what is immoral behavior of this sort. So, I submit to the Pope. I believe he is he's the vicar of Christ, absolutely the true Pope. There are a bunch of people out there who say, well, his election was fraudulent and all of this, he's not the real Pope. No, that's not proven. That's never been shown. I don't believe that at all. When the Pope emerged from the conclave, all the electors were in agreement that he was the Pope. And then no evidence has been shown to show otherwise. But, again, what do we need in the church? We need truth. Jesus Christ is the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So my arguments are not based on, well, Father Murray's smarter than anyone else. No, there are a lot of people smarter than me. But are we entitled to debate each other when we think there are problems? Of course, that's a duty of charity.
Now, what would you say to the people who say, well, that's just your private interpretation? The Pope is the one who has the authority to interpret a tradition. You don't have the authority to submit a private interpretation. That's just your interpretation.
It's not my interpretation because I'm quoting what his predecessor said. And this is where we get to the issue. You've got to follow the Pope, to which I say, which Pope? The one now or the one before? We don't believe in positivism, which is the theory that the lawgiver has the right to say whatever he wants and we have to obey because he's the lawgiver. The lawgiver in the church is a vicar. He's vicarious power from Christ. So therefore, everything he does is submitted to the doctrine of Christ. And where the doctrine of Christ is clearly known, then we have a basis to say to somebody, you've made a mistake. You have not taught what Jesus taught, and which, by the way, was taught by all your predecessors. The Pope can cite nowhere in the history of the church where any Pope or council taught that people who are in invalid second marriages are entitled to receive the sacraments without repenting of their intention to commit adultery. So that's the kind of approach that I try to take in the book, and that's not a prideful attitude. I say in the book, for instance, we teach seminarians, 6 years of studies. We have exams. We require them to learn the theology. But then when they come out of the seminary, we don't tell them, oh, by the way, everything you taught is subject to revision. And if the Pope contradicts something, then you got to forget about what you learned. No, the Pope can change the law about how many hours you fast for communion. He cannot change the law on what constitutes adultery.
Right. Now, thank you, Dr. Murray. You touch on page 416 on the question of a heretical Pope. Can there be a heretical Pope? What are your thoughts on that?
It's metaphysically possible because, when you're a Pope, you're not impeccable, meaning you can't commit sin. And it is possible for someone to fall into grave error and heresy. Father Fessio a few years ago said, what would we do if the Pope became a Muslim? Let's say the Pope said, I believe in what Muhammad taught, and therefore I no longer believe in what Jesus taught. That's pretty clear. Now, the chances are if that were to happen, he would quit the pontificate, that he would say, since I no longer believe in this religion, I no longer want anything to do with it. So that would be a manifest case where that could happen. The tougher question is, what about if a Pope teaches something that contradicts or seems to contradict previous teaching? Is he teaching it in such a way that he acquires a canonical penalty? Because it has to be done knowingly and obstinately. And in church law, no one judges the Pope. So there's no authority that can say, yes, the Pope has committed the canonical crime of teaching heresy and publicly professing heresy. So unless the Pope were to step aside on his own, he continues to be Pope, and we as a community of believers have to appeal to him to put off his errors and ask him not to try to coerce people to agree with him.
Excellent. Now you you've alluded to this a few times. Positivism, talked about tribunals. Something that you go back to again and again is law and order. You say in 385, quote, basically, bishops enjoy total authority in their diocese subject to canon law, but many of them ignore canon law, and oftentimes the Pope is unaware of or doesn't choose to intervene when problems occur, end quote. Can you speak on this sort of breakdown of canonical procedure? Do you think that a lot of bishops or even popes are acting like positivists, just sort of imposing their will, not according to the law? Can you comment on that?
Well, no, it's clear. In church law, it's unlike secular law where you have, the division of responsibility for government, executive, legislative, and judicial. And the three branches in the civil government, one group writes the law, another authority enforces it, and then a third judges violations of the law or disputes on the meaning of the law. So the legislature, the executive, and the judicial. In the church, the bishop has all three powers in his diocese. So if he does not voluntarily cooperate with church law, meaning follow all the exact measures laid out in the Code of Canon Law, and he does something that offends the rights of either priests or lay people in his diocese, who's going to stop him? The only one who can stop him is the superior authority, the Pope. But the Pope doesn't have the mechanisms to easily do that for the entire world church. You have to basically count on some person who's been offended to bring that case to Rome after trying to get the Pope, the local bishop, to overturn it. This often happens in cases regarding the rights of priests. So if priests are accused, for instance, of sexual abuse of a minor, church law has provisions that treats him as a civil court or as a criminal court would. You're under accusation, but you still have right to self-defense. And the right to self-defense means you have a right to know the charges, to see the evidence, and then to respond to them. And often, from what I've read and even things I know, those procedures to defend the right of priests to have self-defense are kind of ignored, aren't fulfilled properly. And then people are coerced into going along with unjust solutions. So, often priests are accused of sexual abuse of minors, and that's a horrible crime. We deal with it in the book. But, they're said, well, if you voluntarily quit the priesthood, then we'll give you a pension and then everything will go away. Well, that's not how church law is supposed to work. If there's a crime committed, you have to prosecute it according to the law. So that's why, Rome is the area where you can appeal a bishop's decisions, administrative or otherwise, to get relief, but it's an onerous process. It doesn't always result in a speedy resolution to the case. So, in the Catholic Church, cooperation is basically the basis for social harmony. We all believe the same thing, and we're all striving for the same goal, so we should all act according to the same law. Where that breaks down, then that's when we get divisions and rights violated.
Now, Henry Sear wrote the book The Dictator Pope, where he claimed that Pope Francis was essentially running the church like a dictatorship, i.e., there is no law except my will. Do you think that Pope Francis or other bishops are running the church like a dictatorship in just ignoring the law, imposing their will, and there's not little or no recourse?
Well, Sire cites different cases of that. And, I have to say, I shake my head at some of the things the Pope does. The Pope has supreme authority, so he can determine things. But he's also subject to the law, meaning that when you become Pope, all the laws don't get wiped off the book, and then you basically tell people, well, we're going to do this, that, and this. So when you're ordained, when you become Pope, rather, you go into a position in which there are laws which are meant to protect both the office of Peter, but then also the rights of people under him. So we had the case of the Archbishop of Guam, which is an American possession in the Pacific, and he was accused of multiple cases of sexual abuse of minors. The Pope did, I thought, a very good thing. He delegated Cardinal Burke to go and do a canonical trial. So Cardinal Burke went and they took evidence and it was all proper. Cardinal Burke then concluded the process and submitted his decision to the Holy See for publication, which is what you do in a trial. And the Pope said no. He said, I'm taking the case to myself, I'll decide. And then he didn't remove this bishop from the priesthood. He simply gave him some penalties, including you can't live in Guam anymore. And when you publicly celebrate Mass, you can't wear the bishop's accoutrements, mitre and crozier and the like. So that the sentence was never published. We never heard the evidence. The victims never got vindicated, for instance, in knowing that their claims had been found either, in favor of or against by Cardinal Burke's tribunal. It's not to the good of the Pope or the good of anyone else, because if you disregard the law on one thing, then people are going to expect that might happen in the next. So they're kind of not confident how they're supposed to act. And the trial of Cardinal Betchou, for instance, right now he's being tried at the Vatican State Tribunal. And there were, papal actions to modify existing law before that trial began, or just as it began. And you have to say to yourself, really, that's modifying the law as a trial begins is not a good idea. You may think it's going to produce a result you want, but you're undermining legitimacy in many ways in the sight of the world. If the law was poorly written and he gets tried and you don't get your result, then after the fact, you rewrite the law. And if you have poor evidence, try him on another charge. If you don't, well, that's what justice is all about. So these are regrettable examples, and they're not based, I think, simply on the fact that, well, this is the way I look at it. No, it's clear. Certain things were laid down in church law, and they're just ignored. The Pope the other day celebrated Mass without wearing vestments. I don't know if you heard about that. He just celebrated Mass, which is not usual. Pope is usually the principal celebrant, but he was sitting in his white cassock next to the altar, and he stood up and started celebrating. This is a violation of liturgical law. His first Holy Thursday, when he was Pope, he did the washing of the feet, and he insisted that there be women present. And not only, we also had women, and then we've also had non-believers, in other words, non-Christians. This is not what the church law established. Now, he changed the law subsequently, but when he violated it at the first Mass, you have to say to yourself, Holy Father, who are you hurting here? Your own authority, because you're treating the law as something that has no value in and of itself and can be discarded without any explanation.
Yes, now speaking of liturgical law, I want to get into the liturgical controversy. First, you say on page 75, quote, as a priest, you certainly learn more about the nature of the Mass by offering the old Mass, end quote. Can you speak at all about your own experience with the Latin Mass and how it has affected your priesthood?
Yes, well, when I was in the seminary, the Tridentine Mass, was prohibited. It wasn't allowed. It was never done. We knew that the follower of Archbishop Lefebvre, the priests, were doing it, but we didn't have it. And then Pope John Paul II, following the illegal consecrations in 1988, done by Archbishop Lefebvre, he granted permission. So the Fraternity of St. Peter was founded. So I basically learned the old Mass. A fraternity priest taught me, and I also watched videos. And then when permission was given by my own diocese, I requested permission to celebrate the Mass. I was very happy because I started doing it. And, I saw a whole new depth. I realized that the new Mass is in many ways a reduced version, and was simplified, leaving out some prayers, rituals. And I say to myself, well, on comparison, I think a lot of those rituals are very good to keep, like the double genuflection. In the old Mass, when the priest consecrates, before he shows it to the people, he genuflects. And that teaches that in any action, the first thought has to go to God, not to our fellow man. So God comes down on the altar, I genuflect. Then I hold up the host, the people can worship, and then I genuflect again. Same with the chalice. So that kind of action, people say, well, it's simplified, one genuflection, not two. Not a great idea. I remember talking to Alice von Hildebrand, you mentioned her earlier, we were discussing the prayers at the foot of the altar. And she says how profoundly wise it was in the old Mass. Before the priest approached the altar, he asked pardon for his sins. So therefore, at the foot of the altar, sort of like on the entryway in, the first thing we do is not greet the Lord by kissing the altar, which represents his body. We ask pardon for us, and then we go up. So those kind of changes, I said, there's a lot of value here in the Old Mass.
Yeah, you say on page 405, the reform of the Mass and the other liturgical rites following the Second Vatican Council resulted in a loss of a sense of the sacred and the eternal through the elimination of words and gestures, as you just mentioned. And you go on and say, the revised liturgy was intentionally reworked to be more akin to Protestant worship in style and didacticism, less mystical and heaven-directed, end quote. So what do you see as the solution to this situation? Do you agree with Benedict's Summorum Pontificum as the mutual enrichment to try to resolve this?
I do think the mutual enrichment is good. I think we should have, I think Traditionalis Custodes was a mistake to try and, with the Pope restricted the celebration of the Mass, saying that it causes disunity. I think it's the exact opposite. The disunity is now caused by the forbidding people to have this Mass. So therefore, I think it would be good. People like the old Mass should be able to go to it. Priests who like it should be able to celebrate it. But I think there's a bigger problem, which is most people are going to be going to the new Mass throughout the world, and that needs to be, the reform of the reform. And I basically like what happened after the immediate council votes to reform the liturgy, which is that there was a mixture of Latin and English, but it was basically the old Mass with a few changes. And I think that's good. If there's one thing I like in Traditionalis Custodes is, but I don't think it should be mandatory, but that the readings should also be done in the vernacular. Now, when I celebrate the Mass for public, we would read the readings before the homily, after the Latin readings, and that can be maintained. But it's the more reverence is communicated, the better. And I think your average Latin Mass goer was not going there because they, were simply unhappy where they were. They were also seeking more. So rather than just complain, they said, "Let me do something that'll bring me closer to God." And I think we need to make that available.
Yes. So you mentioned Traditionalis Custodes. What is your canonical opinion of that document in terms of, as we just said, law and order? What is the legal status of it? Can you comment on that? You wrote a piece, I believe it was the Catholic thing on this. Can you summarize your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we're dealing with three things. Traditionalis Custodes, which was July 16, 2021. Which immediately came into effect. So it was like a hammer blow, because suddenly everything that had been done for the last approximately 25 to 30 years is now coming either under being forbidden or severely restricted. Then the Congregation of Divine Worship issued the response to dubias, which made further restrictions. And then we have the decree that the Pope issued in the month of February for the Fraternity of St. Peter. And also, I believe that decree also applies to other congregations in communities in the church, which are, as a charism, celebrate the old liturgy, that they're allowed to continue to celebrate the old Mass and the other rites. So there's a lot of legal confusion here. The dubia were not well written, in my opinion. They leave things out. They make assertions that have nothing to do with Traditionalis Custodes, as a matter of saying Traditionalis Custodes taught this, not really. But then again, Traditionalis Custodes I find unconvincing in the rationale given for it, and then its implementation or things that say, for instance, Traditionalis Custodes only mentions the Mass. It doesn't mention the other sacramental books. It doesn't mention the breviary, which is the praying of the Psalms that the church. So Summorum Pontificum dealt with all of those other things with the exception of the rite of ordination. So we got from a more complete account to an incomplete account, and then the dubia started addressing, saying that interpreting Traditionalis Custodes, you're not allowed to use confirmation in the old rite, whereas that had never been said in Traditionalis Custodes. So this requires a lot of study and reconciliation to figure out, what the law is and what it should be.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely a lot of study figuring out what's going on, what to do. Are you still able to say the old Mass in your diocese?
The Cardinal is currently studying the implementation of Traditionalis Custodes. And in fact, at our clergy meeting he requested information where the old mass is celebrated. So he's going to come up with a policy. So right now the situation is as it was before Traditionalis Custodes was issued, but we're expecting a policy to come soon.
Okay. All right. Well, as we wrap up, I'd like to talk about solutions. Where do we go from here? One of the things you mentioned, again, Hildebrand, you mentioned the charitable anathema on page 215. Is this one of the solutions that we need, an anathema to restore some law and order? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the charitable anathema was a statement Dietrich von Hildebrand used to say, what should the church do in the face of modern errors and doctrinal deviations? And it goes back to the fact that in the past, when councils would condemn an error or a heresy, they would say, anathema sit. Anyone who believes this, that's this, anathema sit. So basically say anathema sit means that should be stopped. That is castigated, that's punished, that's wrong. So yes, stating with clarity the errors that you're supposed to avoid is a very good form of charity. Now it has to be complemented with an explanation of why the truth is to be believed in. We believe on the basis of authority. The God revealing only reveals truth and goodness. Therefore, everything he reveals is true and good. But to understand why God revealed that we have to act in a certain way, the morality of the Ten Commandments, for instance, it's not arbitrary. It completely fits in with human nature and with the nature of society. Social beings can't live in a society in which the Ten Commandments are ignored. It'll be a brutal kind of lifestyle. So, yeah, to identify errors is not a negative activity. It's sort of like people say, I don't want to be negative. I just want to say positive things. But, if you tell a guy, stop smoking, it hurts your lungs, that sounds kind of negative. But the reality is you need to cultivate good habits so you have healthy lung capacity. Now, and that's an example. But in the moral life of, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, we want to tell people there's a reason for doing that. You please God and you help your neighbor when you tell the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We don't want to be too negative, but it's not negative to correct your neighbor and help him. Now, but the anathema is something that is really the clergy's purview. I can't issue an anathema as a layperson. But you mention a lot in your book about the role of the laity and what the laity can do. I want to read this final quote from your book. This is from page 119. You say this: the challenges facing the church today are not primarily a matter of how we are going to implement Vatican II. The challenge facing the church is how are we going to revive Christianity within the Catholic Church among a people who are losing interest. That's where the Catholic laity are often leading the way, and the many Catholic apostolates are doing a tremendous amount of good. And this, you highlight in multiple places, the work of Mother Angelica. So how is Mother Angelica sort of a model layperson, a model for lay people to follow in our day?
Well, Mother Angelica's appeal is universal. So priests, bishops, cardinals, even popes, listen to her. But most of her influence is on lay people. And even lots of non-Catholics. Most of the people now working at EWTN are lay people. Most of the content is provided by lay people, although priests like me and Father Mitch and the Franciscans down in Alabama we're very happy to be part of it. But lay people have, in the modern world, higher levels of education than they did 200 years ago on average, meaning there are more people with deeper knowledge of Catholicism than there were previously. That may be a debate on how deep the knowledge is, but I remember when the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars was founded, which was a group founded after the council to promote Orthodox teaching in universities and seminaries, it was all run by priests. Now it's all run by lay people because the lay people have become the professors. I look at the St. Paul Biblical Center, who are the ones publishing this book. That's almost entirely made up of lay people and many converts of the faith. So, God raises up those people who can do the great amount of good for the church and they have to realize that this is a blessed moment for them to take on roles that are of great use to the church. And I think most bishops and people, involved in academic life, they know that educated laymen are often the ones who will give the best advice to them because they have a broad perspective. And in the case of those who've studied theology, they have a deep knowledge of the subject. And they're doing it often at financial distress to them because they could be making more money in other professions. So as we get less clergy, we're going to have more laity who are going to be able to do a lot of good for the church. But we want them to provide the next generation of priests by having big families. So I'll say that.
Yes. Yeah, and of course, that's the primary vocation of the lay people is to raise Catholic families. As you said in the very beginning, the impact of your parents. Now, in closing, one last question: if we do have a lay person who I'm a lay person and I run OnePeterFive. It's an online apostolate. I find the internet to be a very poisonous place. A lot of people just being very uncharitable, acrimonious to one another. And yet there's a lot of possibility and potential there as well. Can you speak at all about lay people on the internet? How can we do good for the church and for souls?
Well, pray to the Holy Spirit for guidance, of course, before you speak or write. And then, I always, the kind of principle is anything you say, you should be ready to defend in front of your grandmother as being appropriate and true. And in other words, usually the grandparents are the ones who can tell us, because they watch us grow up, and the parents are hoping the kids turn out well. Well, the grandparents are too, but they're going to say, hey, by the way, your parents should have told you this, So, in other words, say things that you're willing to defend happily. And, I agree, there's a lot of cruelty in things I see on the internet, and that's not the way Jesus and the apostles spoke. Peter and Paul got into debates, but they didn't get into epithets and destructive personal vendettas. So, that's not naivete to say that we should be charitable and truthful at the same time. That really is the Christian vocation.
Excellent. Well, that's a great rule of thumb. Don't say anything on the internet that you're not ready to defend in front of grandma. That's a great, I love it. It's a great way to break that down. So once again, viewers and listeners, you can pre-order Calming the Storm with Diane Montagna. You can pre-order that at the link below. And then that'll be available in a print copy early April. So Father Murray, thank you so much for your time today. Can you give us a final blessing?
Yes. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, fill you with his wisdom and strength, and guide you on the paths toward eternal life, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.